took place in 1862 during this Civil War campaign. It includes battle scenes that are among the least accurate battle scenes ever made. I won't be showing any clips from that. But I'm Fred Christensen. I've been doing talks for these nice people here for some time, and most of these talks are slightly abbreviated versions of the classes at OLLI, OLLI, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. If you don't know about that, I will provide more details later. The Santa Fe Trail we covered about a month ago, and technically this is a portion of that. For that, I took email addresses from those who wanted to receive handouts, electronic handouts sent to you. I'll have a bunch more, well, several more from these classes. And if you are not on the list of receiving those, here's a sign-up sheet on which you can put your name and email address. We can start it around here. If you're already on it, just draw a smiley face next to your first name or something. But this was an interesting topic, I think you'll find. This is the most remote and perhaps the least well-known of all the Civil War campaigns. And it was in many ways also the oddest and most unusual. I filmed the sections you're going to see in 1997. We were out in Albuquerque where my wife's family lived. We were there at Christmas. I got a camcorder as a Christmas gift. I had been making videos using my brother's camcorder with him along, but I did film these with a 1997 technology camcorder. Since then I've had 4 others, each one half the size and twice the quality of the one before. So I don't make apologies for the film quality of the landscapes you will be seeing. I did take a few still pictures. That's what it looked like in December of 1997. This is Fort Craig, New Mexico, quite a remote location, and we'll pay you to visit now as we move on. This is the American Civil War, of course. The main action took place in the East, as everyone knows, with huge armies of 40, 50, 100,000 men in Virginia. Out here in the far west, that scale was impossible. The climate, the supply lack meant that armies couldn't be more than 2,000 or 3,000 at the very most. On this particular episode of the Civil War, there are good books. These were published about 20 years ago, but they're still the best ones that cover this particular campaign. There was a lot more going on in the West, in the Southwest in those days than just North versus South. The Native Americans were also very much involved. And the campaigns here included, well, dealing with the Navajo, the Apache, the Comanche. We won't be covering that in this class, but for an overall view of what conditions were like back then, these are 2 very good books that discuss that. One handout that I will send you about the Civil War is from everybody's favorite Civil War historian, Bruce Catton. His books written 60 years ago are still very much worth reading. He was a literary master. It's beautiful writing. And one chapter in one of his books gives you as good a summary as I've ever seen of what life was like for the soldiers. Everyday life, food, medicine, the experience of combat, the way they fought their battles. So this particular section here, Crackers and Bullets, I will email out to you if you want to receive it. If you're really into the Civil War, of course, you would dive into the 128 volumes of the official records, the OR. Some people have complete sets of this. Today, of course, it's all available online where it takes up no room and weighs nothing. But during the war, every officer was required to send in after-action reports following any kind of activity. And all that paper was saved in the War Department in the 1880s and 90s. Tremendous job was done getting it all organized and printed. There was also an atlas that came with all this. Yeah?
Were the Southern officers required to do that too?
The Southern officers were required to do that for the Confederate government in Richmond. The official records does include as many Confederate records as survived. It was a bit more patchy than the Northern records, but still it's quite a complete, satisfying coverage of the Southern reports as well. In this case, General Sibley was the one in New Mexico who had to send those in. There was an official atlas published along with all those volumes. These were maps ranging from very accurately done ones by engineers at that time, and every West Pointer was effectively a trained engineer, and also rough sketches of what a battle might have looked like. But these two are reproduced quite nicely. The battle we're looking at today, Valverde, has these maps showing how it went. Another good source of information, the 4 volumes of Battles and Leaders. The Century magazine commissioned articles by all these surviving veterans about their experiences, and then organized them, published them. Many of these people were quite opinionated, and the editors of the magazine and of these volumes took care to write in footnotes and also put in the opposing view of somebody who might have different attitudes about who should get the credit or the blame for everything. Quite useful. You could get these as e-books on Kindle for a low price. Sometimes the out of copyright books are produced in cheap editions. Somebody took the time to really do a good job on these 4 volumes, and they're quite inexpensive. Highly recommended. Any Civil War buff ought to get the official records. I can also send you a copy of this National Geographic map, which came out in 1961. It's splendidly detailed. The copy I will send you is a PDF file, which means you can twitch your fingers on your iPad or whatever to enlarge it, and the fine print details are still sharp and clear. But this is as good a map of the Civil War with lots of information as could be done. It includes a section on the war in the Southwest, which we'll be taking a look at during this hour and next week's hour. Generations later, National Geographic did another map, which was very disappointing. Every major event is shown, but only as an anonymous red dot. That is not useful. So if you want a good map of the Civil War, the earlier National Geographic is their masterpiece. On the armies that fought, this was published in Army Times some decades ago, and it packs a lot of useful information here about U.S. military history. What you can see here is, well, first of all, the scale on this changes. Every 5,000 men, up to maybe 45,000 in the War of 1812, and here it changes to 500,000 increments. And then up here, 5 million increments. But the continuing theme is that the U.S. has never had or wanted, in these earlier years, a large standing army. It kept a small army of professionals, and when a war broke out, volunteers would flock to the colors, and the numbers, as you can see, would spike and then go back down. For the Civil War, for the first time, you have it going over 1 million people on the Union side. And it does go on to modern wars as well. We could do a whole 8-week OLLI class just on this one chart. We could also look at this. 50 years ago, I prepared this for military science students. A few good definitions. Strategy, the big picture, and tactics, the nitty-gritty of how to fight a battle. Strategy means that you want to fight the right battle. Tactics, you want to fight the battle right. The Army has its list of 9 principles of war. I'll send this out to you also, and you can use this as a checklist for understanding any military action that happens. One difference between then and now is that the armies back then tended to fight in linear formations. We do not do that anymore. But for thousands of years, they made perfectly good sense. In a pre-machine gun age, linear formations was the most effective way to use your single-shot muzzle-loading rifle, which is what most of the troops in the Civil War had. And in a pre-electronic communications age, you are one man on a horse. How are you going to control the actions of, say, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 men? Linear formations were just about the only way to make that doable. With modern electronic communications, things change. Of course, they had their problems. They were suited for open country, and in New Mexico, the country is about as open as you could possibly imagine. But battles fought in dense woods, the armies there might have problems, as history shows. Also, if you're in a linear formation and you have a flank at one end of that line, and that would be a possible weak point. Guarding it by putting it in proper terrain or having cavalry there would be the way to do it. We don't fight that way anymore, but in today's world, linear tactics are still used by countries whose rulers don't want their soldiers to think for themselves. That explains, I think, some of what's been going on in Ukraine and how the Russian army has done so poorly. But again, let's move back in time again. On the Civil War in the Southwest, these are a couple of basic factors. In the East, you could have huge armies supplied by railroad lines and rivers, and all those big armies had to stay close to either a railroad line or a river. Except Sherman in 1864, whose army ate its way through Georgia and South Carolina, living off the country. In the Southwest, you don't have railroads yet. You do have one river that's not navigable, the Rio Grande, and you have issues of supply, logistics being absolutely decisive in how big an army could be. There was that small regular army, and when the war broke out, most of those troops were brought east to form the nucleus of an expanded main military force. Both the North and the South did that. That meant that out here in the West, volunteers were tremendously important and played a very big role. Colorado, 3,000, New Mexico, 5,000, California, 16,000. They did not show up in New Mexico until the events we're looking at here were completed. But again, many civil wars at once. The armies that fought had to keep one eye on the Navajo, the Apache, the Comanche. That reduction in the regular army forces meant that they could, well, do things on their own. They also had things done to them by militia. For example, Colonel Chivington in Colorado, and the famous Sand Creek Massacre. Definitely a war crime. But we won't get into that too much here. This is, well, the main armies decided the war east of the Mississippi. In Missouri, it's a sideshow. Out here in New Mexico, it's definitely the sideshow of a sideshow. But it would have been enormously important if the South had won the war in the East, because what happened out here determined how much territory the Confederacy would control. The Texans who fought in New Mexico wanted to keep on going as far as Denver and San Francisco. Here's that National Geographic map with details. You'll get a copy of this and can read these, and we can follow through them here as well. In those days, too, both North and South had to divide the country up into geographic military departments just to make sense out of everything and to have a clear-cut chain of command. In 1862, each of these had a general or a colonel in charge. The ones in the East, of course, are quite well known. Robert Lee on the southern side, and at this period, George McClellan on the Union side. Others in the Midwest, Grant is not quite shown. He was Halleck's second in command for these few months. But then out in the west you have others. And here in New Mexico, Sibley and Canby are the people to look at, or the people we will be looking at. Before the war, the Southerners had their dream of empire. And the war actually broke out, not because of the existence of slavery, but because of efforts to expand slavery, to push it into new territories. And it was that which produced the worst of the clashes before 1861 between North and South. The Southerners had visions, had dreams of a slave empire. In one alternate history novel, Harry Turtledove gives you a victorious Confederacy extending to the Pacific, taking over parts of northern Mexico into their country. Interesting novel, but did not quite happen, but it wasn't for lack of trying. And here's a good book about this concept that was in the minds of many Southerners, and that encouraged President Jefferson Davis to authorize Colonel Sibley, General Sibley, to raise an army to try to conquer the Southwest. That's New Mexico Territory in 1861. Remember that this had just been brought into the U.S. in the Mexican War in 1848. So it and its Hispanic inhabitants were newly acquired U.S. citizens. Henry Sibley is the Southern commander for this operation. I guess I could give away the ending. If there were a contest for the worst Civil War commander, he would be certainly among the top 2 or 3. We will see him in operation. He had a great vision, but we'll see how that went. His counterpart, Edward Canby, competent, cautious, sensible, not flamboyant. We'll see how he did in this campaign, and he did serve the Union quite well in later campaigns. So these would be the 2 rivals that we're looking at during this story. Sibley convinced President Davis to authorize all this. He was going to recruit 2,500 Texan volunteers for his so-called Army of New Mexico, marching them 600 miles to El Paso and then heading north along the Rio Grande. He did not concern himself very much with logistics. He thought that his army could overpower enemies, seize whatever they needed when they occupied Union-held forts and towns. Not concerning yourself with logistics in the desert Southwest produces interesting results, as we will see. That does not seem like a force big enough to conquer an entire continent, but in 1848, Stephen Kearny's army, the Army of the West in the Mexican War, did do that with a force even smaller than Sibley's. It helps to not have huge forces on the other side that you have to deal with. Each side had its organization, its chain of command, organized into regular infantry units on the northern side, not a huge number, but some, and then much larger volunteers. New Mexico volunteers, Colorado volunteers, we'll see them making an appearance next week, and New Mexico Hispanics, whose fighting qualities varied from very good to not good at all. Sibley also had his, there's that Union lineup. From the Confederates, the regimental commanders, the 3 that are shown here, were quite important because of Sibley's own, shall we say, deficiencies. He drank heavily, and his troops came to call him the walking whiskey keg. So the qualities of these other leaders would play a role in this. Here's that National Geographic map with the background to what we're about to see. At the beginning of the Civil War, Fort Bliss, occupied by the Texans under Colonel Baylor. The last time I gave this class, somebody asked, is he connected to Baylor University? His uncle was the founder of that institution. The Confederates the Union had abandoned a few of its remotest outposts, fallen back a bit. So the Confederates began the war with a toehold in New Mexico. This Sibley Brigade, or the Army of the West, if you will, had to first make it to El Paso, and even this march across West Texas was pretty grim. The supplies were not generous. The water supplies meant that the units had to string themselves out a day apart, so that when each one drank a well dry, it would be able to be replenished for the next unit a day later. Sibley's army had one interesting private, Alfred Peticolas, who kept a diary and who drew sketches. And it's quite nice to have all this available. That book, Rebels on the Rio Grande, is the story of Peticolas and his artwork and his comments on the whole thing. Definitely worth reading. So the campaign was underway. The Confederate 2,500 men marching north from El Paso. The map here, which is in the Civil War in New Mexico brochure that I hope you picked up and that you'll also get as an email item, shows you basically the pattern of the whole campaign. As you might expect, the armies could not go far from the Rio Grande and from water. When they got to the northern area around Albuquerque and then Santa Fe, they were on the Santa Fe Trail. And the crucial actions that we'll look at next week definitely took place right along the Santa Fe Trail. Obstacle, though, for the Confederates heading north, the first big one would be Fort Craig, New Mexico, on the Rio Grande. That's where Canby, the Union commander, chose to send his forces and to make his stand, to try to block or halt these advancing troops. Fort Craig looked like that when it was intact. Today it's a historic site. It's run by the Bureau of Land Management. There are historical markers there. You have to drive, from the nearest interstate about 20 miles over a bumpy road to get to it. And of course there's no people there to entertain you or inform you, but plenty of information signs. So that takes us up to, about ready to encounter, the two armies about ready to encounter each other. Before we go on into what happened next, are there any questions or comments out? That's a quick gallop through the background of this whole campaign. But today, if you go out there, it looks like that. That's the officers' quarters. Adobe and some stone. They do have a flagpole flying, and I guess somebody goes out there once a day to take care of it. But as you can see, it's pretty bleak. The Rio Grande is not too far away from there. The fort itself had big structures for their warehouses. The people who built these forts were acutely aware of the importance of supply. These buildings would have been intact. They were inside the fort where Canby could use them. They were, things that Sibley hoped to capture. But let's take a look at Fort Craig in the background.
This is the Jornada del Muerto, the Dead Man's Walk. That's the driest and most dangerous stretch of the old Spanish road that led from El Paso north towards Albuquerque and Santa Fe. The shortcut, the most dangerous part of all, was back there in the desert beyond the Rio Grande. But in February 1862, when General Henry Sibley's 2,500 Texas Confederates came this way, he would definitely have needed to stay a lot closer to the river. We can barely see the glint of the river itself, about halfway out to the horizon here. By the middle of February 62, he would have been approaching this point, and this would have been the first most difficult place for him to overcome. This is Fort Craig, New Mexico territory. General Edward Canby, the Union commander in New Mexico, had chosen to make this one of his two main defensive sites to resist the Confederate onslaught. And by February 1862, he had 3,800 troops concentrated here. About 1,200 of them were U.S. Army regulars, tough fighting men, extremely well trained. Most of the rest were New Mexico volunteers, Hispanic troops, in whom Colonel Canby did not have a great deal of confidence. The local New Mexicans did not have a strong military tradition. They had only been conquered by the United States just over a decade before, and so did not have a great deal of loyalty to one side or the other in this Civil War. But in any case, a large number of volunteers did join up. The best of them were in 2 units. Colonel Kit Carson, the famous frontiersman, pioneer, explorer, pathfinder, commanded the 1st New Mexico Volunteers, the unit that got the best training and had the highest morale. And the other unit worth mentioning, Captain Paddy Graydon's company of scouts or spies, used for reconnaissance. Captain Graydon was an extremely imaginative, lively person. He was described as ubiquitous in many of the reports, and we'll hear more of him later. But in any case, the regulars and the local volunteers made up a mixed force. Colonel Canby did not have a great deal of confidence in the volunteers, but he did have 3,800 men here, enough, he hoped, to block or halt the Confederate invasion. Graydon and his scouts kept Canby well informed about the approach of the Confederates. And on February 16th, 1862, about a mile in that direction to the south of Fort Craig, Sibley's army deployed for battle. Canby led his troops out to face them in the field. There was, however, no battle of Fort Craig. Canby saw no reason to bring on a fight. Sibley knew that he was somewhat outnumbered. He didn't have any idea what the quality of the troops was facing him. And indeed, the idea of a frontal assault in the middle of this bleak and forbidding terrain did not seem too appealing. After the end of the day on the 16th, Sibley and his Confederates fell back a few miles to the little village of Peralta, south of here, to think about what to do next. Canby then brought his troops back here to the fort. A direct assault on the fort would have not been a very smart thing to do. You can see the walls built in early 1862, earthen walls, cannon all along the top of them. Many of those guns were so-called Quaker guns, painted logs. But the Confederates, of course, could not know that. These are the supply storage facilities over here. The commander's quarters, the brick remains of them, you can see right there by the flagpole. The parade ground here in the center of the fort, the officers' quarters would have been on the far side, and the enlisted men's quarters here, right near these walls. And again, altogether, very much too difficult a military obstacle for General Sibley to try to take. After a day or so at Peralta, recovering from their long march to this point, Sibley and his commanders decided what to do. They would cross the Rio Grande to the east and march up through the Dead Man's Walk, through the dry area, around Fort Craig, and behind that mesa that you see there, the Mesa de la Contadera. On the far side of that mesa is a ford over the Rio Grande at Valverde. A tiny village was there at that time. If Sibley and his men could get there, they would have cut the supply line of Fort Craig back to the north. Hopefully he would be able to lure Canby's troops out into an open field battle there under more advantageous circumstances. Perhaps they could catch Canby by surprise and defeat his forces piecemeal up there north of the mesa. Anyway, it sounded like a pretty good idea at the time. The alternatives were going back to El Paso, admitting failure, or doing a frontal assault on the fort. And neither one of those sounded too practicable. Anyway, that's what happened. On the 19th and 20th, the Confederates crossed the river. On the night of the 20th, they spent a dry camp back there behind the mesa. Canby and a good many of his troops crossed over also, facing them from near the top of the bluffs over there. No battle again was fought. Neither Canby nor Sibley wanted to engage each other back at that point. During that night before the battle, two interesting things happened. One was the episode of Captain Graydon and his torpedo mules. I asked the person showing this video to give you the details on that one once the film is done. In any case, that one climaxed with a loud explosion out there in the middle of the desert, which awakened the wreck.
I can pause, I can tell the story now. Here's the report on it. On the evening of the 20th, Graydon was allowed to make a night attack upon them. Without explaining the details of his plan, he had prepared a couple of wooden boxes, in each of which half a dozen 24-pounder howitzer shells were placed, with the fuses cut. These boxes were securely lashed on the backs of two old mules. And the captain, with 3 or 4 of his men, crossed the river below the fort, proceeded in the darkness toward the Confederate camp. Graydon's project was to get the torpedo mules within sight of the enemy's picket line without being discovered, when he was to light the fuses, and the mules being directed towards the picket line would move in the direction of the animals there. He finally arrived within 150 yards of that line, and everything being in readiness, the fuses of the boxes were fired. The captain and his party commenced their retreat, when, to their consternation, they found that the mules, instead of going toward the enemy, were following themselves. The shells soon began to explode. The Confederate camp was quickly under arms, and Graydon's party made its way back to Fort Craig without the mules. So sometimes things happen.
So uncomfortable Confederates. Perhaps the explosion had something to do with the next event that happened, because about 150 of the horses and mules belonging to the 4th Texas Mounted Volunteers, affected by the thirst of that dry camp, and perhaps upset by the explosion, broke loose from their restraints, stampeded down to the Rio Grande, just north of the mesa there. The rather surprised and delighted Union pickets rounded up those animals and brought them back here to Fort Craig. What this meant was that the 4th Texas would now have to become the 4th Texas Volunteers, parentheses, dismounted, or close parentheses, for the rest of the combat, for the rest of the campaign. Their remaining horses would have to be used to transport the wagons for what remaining supplies they had. In any case, the next morning of February 21st, the Confederate forces began moving up to the Valverde Ford north of the mesa. And it's there that the battle took place. It's there that we can now proceed.
Any questions about all that? Captain Graydon's career was quite colorful. The famous scene where he starts the mules moving, but then has a difficulty getting them to come back or go the right way, is shown here. But here, this is the north end of the mesa, and you can see the huge black lava slope up there. And that's the Rio Grande. Valverde Fort itself was something like that, as drawn back at that time. And here's the movement of the Confederates, again, back around that mesa. And photographs taken in the mid or late 19th century are pretty fuzzy, but they do show the flat plain that was there, the slopes of the mesa. The Rio Grande itself would be about in the middle of this picture, and the Battle of Valverde is what happened next.
We're now 5 miles from Fort Craig at the northern end of the Mesa de la Contadera, and this is the Rio Grande River, which flows at the base of that mesa. The battlefield of Valverde itself is over here, and as you can see, it's changed in one significant way since 1862. These scruffy trees have taken over the battlefield. They spread up in the 1930s, and so the entire battlefield itself is no longer what it used to be. But the location is the same, and a good viewpoint will let us see what happened. The river itself at this point is in its same channel. Further up, the second significant change is that it has indeed been redirected into a new channel and does not flow in its old bed anymore. The Confederates were to come around the mesa on that side from their dry camp of the night before. The Union forces arriving early in the morning of February 21st from the south side of the mesa, up from Fort Craig. And again, the battle developed as a meeting engagement from this point on about 3/4 of a mile across this open field. We're now on the bluffs overlooking the Rio Grande Valley, 5 miles north of Fort Craig. The battle site's behind us, but I think you can see from this view how bleak and unforgiving this desert terrain is. It was particularly unforgiving of any military force that might have been spies or logistics, and that was to play a really important role in this entire campaign. The battle area itself was down here in the Rio Grande bottoms, and I think you can see how thoroughly the tamarisk trees have overgrown the entire lowlands down there and have covered the entire battlefield. The Mesa de la Contadera is down there, and again down beyond it, Fort Craig. There are two other ways in which this battlefield has changed since 1862. One, of course, is the railroad tracks which you see right down there. Ignored them. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad didn't come through here until the 1880s. And so these were built long after the Civil War. The other thing that has changed is that the Rio Grande itself has changed its course. The main channel that we saw back there by the mesa is now several hundred yards west of where it used to be. And even in 1862, there was evidence that it had changed before. On the far side of the battle area, about a third of a mile from where the Union lines were, was the old channel of the Rio Grande. And parallel to that channel, a line of sand banks or sand ridges played a very important part of the battle. The Confederate troops, as they filed onto the battlefield from behind the mesa, found that line of sand ridges to be a good defensive position, and also a good position from which to launch their attacks. And so it formed their line, almost a natural breastwork, all the way across 3/4 of a mile of the battlefield. The battle began about 8 o'clock in the morning of February 21st. Not all of both armies were here. Sibley sent about 2,000 of his 2,500 men into the battle during the course of the day. The other 500, principally men of the 5th Texas Mounted Rifles, stayed back to launch a feint in the direction of Fort Craig, just to try to keep Colonel Canby from sending all his men up here to the battlefield and to keep him confused about what might be happening. Canby also held back men. He sent about 2,300 of his men here to the battlefield and held back the rest, mainly New Mexico militia, to help defend Fort Craig itself. The absolute worst thing that could happen to him was to lose the fort with all of the stockpile supplies that were in it. Of the 500 Confederates that did not show up on the battlefield, one of them was General Sibley himself. On the morning of the battle, he found himself suddenly taken ill and had to retire to a hospital wagon for the duration of the day. Universally, all the men in his unit believed that the illness was alcohol-induced. Sibley was a heavy drinker. Some of his men called him a walking whiskey keg. And indeed, he may have gotten drunk the morning of the battle and sobered up at the end of the day to find out through his hangover what happened. His second in command was Colonel Tom Green of the 5th Texas, and it was he who actually presided over the battle from the Confederate side. Colonel Green was typical of many of the regimental commanders, both of this part of the Civil War and of the entire war, of the citizen soldiers who took positions of leadership. He was a prominent Texan politician and lawyer. He was a Mexican War veteran with some military experience, and he was a competent tactical commander in this battlefield. The battle opened about 8 o'clock in the morning of February 21st, when 180 men of the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles under Major Charles Pyron came around the mesa and took up their advanced position here off the southern edge of the battlefield. On the Union side, Major Thomas Duncan led the initial contingent. He anchored the Union line nearest to the mesa. Later during the morning, from both armies, more and more troops filed onto the battlefield, extending their lines out across this entire area. At first, the senior commander on the Confederate side was Lieutenant Colonel William Scurry of the 4th Texas, known to his men as Dirty Shirt Scurry, a politician, a lawyer, and a Mexican War veteran on the Texas side, and a pretty ferocious fighting man. For the Yankees, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Roberts, Canby's second in command, initially took charge of the morning deployment. Much of the morning fighting was just initial skirmishing. Nothing really decisive happened as both armies fed their troops into the battlefield. In fact, each side was testing the strength of the other. Each side was waiting to get as many of their own troops as they could into position. And Major Duncan on the extreme right with an artillery section to enter that portion of the line. Duncan led 4 companies of the 3rd U.S. Cavalry, along with a couple of other companies from other units. In this battle, few regiments fought as big solid blocks. In many cases, it would be 8 companies of a certain regiment with 1 or 2 or 3 others attached to it to form a kind of a task force, as we would call it today. And indeed, that's the way these troops assembled themselves for the battle. Down there, Major Duncan on the Union side. Later on in the day, Captain Henry Selden of the 5th U.S. Infantry, with a few other companies attached, spread out here on the northern end of the battlefield and advanced as a sort of a heavy skirmish line toward the Confederate positions. Beyond those sand dunes out there, Colonel Scurry's 4th Texas was in position. Here again, neither side wanted to do too much in the way of a decisive engagement. About 1 p.m., an interesting event happened at this particular part of the battlefield. The Texans had 2 companies of Lancers as part of their force. And about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 70 mounted Lancers belonging to the company of Captain Willis Lang trotted out from behind those sand ridge and prepared to charge the extreme left-hand end of the Union line, right about over there. That end of the line was held by the only company of Colorado volunteers to take part in this battle. More of those people would be coming, as we will see later on. But the 71 men of Captain Theodore Dodd's Colorado volunteers had the honor of withstanding a good old-fashioned cavalry charge of Lancers. The whole idea of Lancers may have been one that came from the Mexican tradition. They certainly had those in the Mexican army back in the Mexican War. But Captain Lang's men had 9-foot lances with 12-inch blades at the end. Each of the lances equipped with a red ribbon intended to soak up the blood of their enemies the same way. They launched their charge. They did not get far. They were shot to pieces by Colonel Dodd's men. Very few of them made it back. Most of the horses were slaughtered. About 20 of the men were killed and injured. The rest staggered back on foot, thinking again about the idea of launching cavalry charges in the Civil War with lancers. One report says that Captain Dodd's men formed a square, the classic old formation for withstanding cavalry charges from the Napoleonic time. Whether that actually happened or not, we're not really sure. But it would have been a neat little tribute to the past on that side, just as the Lancer charge itself was a tribute to the past from the Texans. Anyway, that charge got nowhere. And if it was to be the prelude to an attempt to outflank or assault the line at this point in the battle, nothing else ever developed. And perhaps Colonel Scurry and Colonel Green decided not to do anything more at that time. In the early afternoon, when Colonel Canby rode in from Fort Craig to take charge of the battle, both sides had pretty much fully deployed their troops on the battlefield, and it was time to try something decisive. Colonel Canby wanted to attack with his right and crush the Confederate left, push back behind the sand ridges, and then roll up the troops from left to right. It was an interesting idea. Unfortunately, he couldn't quite pull it off before some more interesting developments happened from the other side. By this point, again, both sides were fully deployed on the battlefield. Here at the Union line, Captain Selden, with his troops of the 5th U.S. Infantry, had fallen back a couple of yards closer to Alexander McRae's artillery battery, which anchored this end of the line. They were to be supported by the New Mexico Volunteers of the 2nd New Mexico Regiment under Colonel Manuel Pino. Pino himself was a very, very brave and energetic man. His troops, as we will see, were not quite of the same quality. In the center of the Union line, the main force to be deployed there was Kit Carson's 1st New Mexico Volunteers, along with some supporting companies of U.S. regulars. Again, on the far right, Major Thomas Duncan and his unit, 3rd U.S. Cavalry, and some others, along with the artillery there, anchored the position closest to the mesa. Before Canby's offensive could get underway, though, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, things started happening. Over behind the Confederate lines, Colonel Greene realized that he'd better do some energetic action in order to try to save the battle and save the entire campaign. Many of his men were not armed with long-range Springfield muskets or anything else of a professional quality. Many of them had shotguns, pistols, a few rifled muskets. Again, they'd have to get in close to the enemy in order to make those short-range weapons do any good. And getting in close to the enemy is what a lot of these rough Texas troops preferred. What Greene chose to do was to launch, first of all, an attack with mounted troops, about 200 of them, on his left against the Union right. This would be under Major Rackway, one of the staff officers of his unit. Once that was underway, then the main attack would happen further left. So about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 200 mounted Texans poured over the sand ridge and galloped toward the enemy position. Major Duncan, his artillery battery, and his troops had to withstand them. They did so quite well. In those days, the doctrine was that an artillery battery could easily hold back any attack coming at it to its direct front. But its flanks were very insecure and always needed to have infantry supporting them, guarding those flanks. That worked out quite well on Duncan's front. Not only was he able to put out an intense fire at those charging horsemen, but Kit Carson's New Mexicans from this central part of the battlefield were able to swing over and deliver a ferocious flanking fire. Rackway's attack failed rather quickly. His men, the survivors, fell back behind the sand ridge. So much for the feint attack.
Kit Carson's men were these.
So after 3:30, the Union right was standing firm, feeling pretty good. The Union center, Kit Carson's troops and their others, had swerved over to the right to join in that battle, to repulse Major Rackway and his horsemen, and then to push on in an attempt to activate Colonel Canby's plan of an offensive by the Union right. That meant that the Union center was pretty well empty for a while. Over on the Union left, Captain Selden and McRae's artillery suddenly had to face the main blow of the Texans. 750 screaming Texans, dismounted this time, many of them from the 4th Texas that had lost their horses the night before, poured over the sand ridge and advanced rapidly against their Yankee opponents. The New Mexico troops of the 2nd New Mexico, those that were across the Rio Grande, failed to stand and fight. They retreated rather quickly. The remainder of that regiment on this bank of the Rio Grande could not be gotten to cross the river. Colonel Pino shouted and screamed at them, but again, they were not responsive to his orders. The Hispanics out here did not have a strong military tradition. They hated, loathed, and feared the Tejanos, the Texans, their hereditary enemies. And in this particular case, they chose not to fight. What this meant was that McRae's artillery battery, his 6 cannon, were overwhelmed by this human wave assault of screaming Texas troops. There was a lot of intense hand-to-hand combat. Bowie knives and bayonets played as big a role as pistol shots and rifle shots and shotgun blasts. When it was all over, McRae himself was dead, Several of the Confederate captains and colonels were also dead, but the charge was victorious, and the Union left was crushed. This was about 4:30 in the afternoon. So, in effect, each side was crushing the left flank of the other. The difference was that there were still some Confederates back there behind the Sand Ridge to stand up against Canby's offensive, whereas on Canby's left, there was nothing to stop the attack. He sounded recall, kicked Carson, Major Duncan, and the other victorious Union troops on the right fell back, and as the sun set, the Union Army poured back across the Rio Grande and back down to Fort Craig. The victorious Confederates were pretty disorganized by their victory, but clearly they had won the day on this battlefield. In terms of casualties, each side had lost about 10% of its total force in this battle. The Union had lost 68 killed, 160 wounded, some of whom died later, and 34 missing, some of them captured. Above all, they had lost those 6 guns of McRae's battery, which forever after would be known as the Valverde battery in the Confederate Army. Confederates lost 36 killed, 150 wounded, and again, some of those were to die later on.
Okay, that was the Battle of Valverde. Comments on all that?
It's interesting to see the ground, that you show the actual location. That's really good.
Right. Theoretically, you could go out and walk over the actual battlefield, but the tamarisk trees cover that entire area. They spread up in the 1930s because of the more salinization, the poorer quality of the ground that encouraged them to spread. So the battlefield itself, well, there's no markers there or anything. But at least I could climb up on a bluff top and then look out over the Rio Grande. Needless to say, going back and forth across the Rio Grande was not tremendously difficult. The water level was not deep back in those days. That's one of Petticolas' sketches of what this all looked like. And that's his sketch of the actual event. The scenes that you saw were reenactors who do go there once a year in their Union and Confederate uniforms to put on a performance and try to get into the spirit of the times. The Lancers, a tiny footnote in military history. Things like this had been more effective in the days when the rifles that would stop them were less accurate and less long range. That had changed by the time of the Civil War. And that's what the reenactors looked like in their current day costumes. The one thing they never do is point their weapons directly at each other when they fire their blanks.
Were those uniforms wool?
They do wear the wool uniforms, and even in hot summer days, they take pride in suffering exactly as the soldiers suffered in the Civil War years. That's what a cavalry force would have looked like, pistols in hand. And that's the blow up of the map showing how this all went. Fort Craig and the notes describing it, the Battle of Valverde attack. Well, he began by trying to attack Sibley's columns. The Confederates, victorious in an all-day battle, continued their march on Santa Fe. In effect, this battle had not produced the supply-rich capture of the fort that they had hoped for. They had to keep on moving now towards Santa Fe, towards Albuquerque and Santa Fe, without having gained those supplies and with Canby's people still at Fort Craig in their rear. They would hope to deal with him again on another day. There were Texans buried there either on the day of the battle or more likely a few days later by local people. The nearest town to the north of the battlefield is Socorro, and the church there is still there today, and a lot of the wounded were treated in that location. But that's the scenery, the image going on farther to the north. I have one more 5-minute video, and we have 5 minutes left in the hour.
When Sibley sobered up or recovered from his illness that evening, Colonel Green announced that they had won the battle. But now the problem was what to do next. Canby in Fort Craig refused to demand to surrender. So Sibley now had, again, 3 choices. He could lay siege to Fort Craig or try to assault it. Not an option. He only had about 5 days' supply left. And again, this desert environment would be pretty unforgiving, and he could hardly afford to take the crippling losses from an assault. He could go back to Fort Bliss and El Paso and call the whole thing off, but not after a glorious battlefield victory. That was totally impossible. Or he could proceed on to the north, towards Albuquerque and Santa Fe and Fort Union, the other Union stronghold, appropriately named, in New Mexico. Perhaps up there he could gather new supplies. He could proceed on into the Colorado gold fields, and he could deal with Canby if and when Canby ever emerged from Fort Craig to follow him north. That's what Sibley decided to do. After a day of taking care of the wounded, reorganizing, trying to distribute evenly as many supplies as they had left, Sibley's army then headed north towards Socorro, the nearest town of any size, 30 miles north, and towards Albuquerque, 100 miles from here. And beyond that, another 78 miles, Santa Fe, and beyond that, 80 miles through the Glorieta Pass, Fort Union. What happens up there, we'll soon see. None of the men who fought here in 1862 could have dreamed that 30 miles east of here, and 83 years in the future, death would pay another visit to this area. This time it would be Death, the destroyer of worlds, in the famous quotation. The Trinity site is over there. In July 1945, that's the location of the first atomic bomb detonation.
Okay, that's what we have time for. And we now have the Confederates continuing their campaign with hopes of final victory if things went their way. Here's the sequence of events that we just looked at. And there's a nice website you can look at. The Bureau of Land Management owns Fort Craig and provides a lot of information about what can be seen there. But you're very much on your own when you pay it a visit. But this does give another nice summary of the entire battle. If we had time, we could sit down and look at these 9 principles of war and use it to evaluate the performance of each of the 2 sides. But I will email you a copy of this, and you can play that mental exercise on your own. But that's the Battle of Valverde. The campaign is well underway. The final decisive battle would take place on the Santa Fe Trail itself. And by the way, one last comment. Amtrak runs through the Glorieta Pass, right through the middle of that battlefield. And it always slows down, I think because of the terrain, as it passes through there. But if you look out the window, you can see all the sites of the Battle of Glorieta Pass that we'll be examining next week. And so that's quite a nice thing for Amtrak to do. Okay, that's it for now. More next week. And thanks for comments now.